Never believe what they told you about Vietnam being just another war. What happened in those highlands was something different, something darker. And one battle proved that soldiers could be pushed beyond any limit imaginable. It's June 1967, the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The 173rd Airborne Brigade is about to walk straight into hell. They don't know it yet, but in just a few hours, they'll be fighting the most savage battle of the entire war. A battle so brutal that grown men would break down crying just talking about it years later. This is the story of Dak To, the battle that showed the world what war really looks like when all rules are thrown out the window.
The problem started months before the first shot was ever fired. North Vietnamese army commanders had been watching American movements in the highlands for over a year. They knew something the Americans didn't. They knew that the thick jungle and mountainous terrain gave them every advantage they could ask for. The NVA had been building up their forces in the border regions near Laos and Cambodia. Thousands of soldiers, hidden bunkers, supply routes. They were preparing for something big. American intelligence had picked up signs of enemy activity near the town of Dak To, but they had no idea about the scale. They thought maybe a few hundred NVA soldiers at most. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The North Vietnamese had positioned over 6,000 battle-hardened troops in the area. Elite units that had been training for months specifically to fight Americans. They had dug in deep, built fortified positions, created killing zones, and they were waiting. The 173rd Airborne Brigade got the order to move into the area and clear it out. Simple search and destroy mission, or so they thought. These weren't fresh recruits. The 173rd was one of the most respected units in the Army. They had been in Vietnam since 1965. They knew the jungle. They knew the enemy. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming.
The operation began on November 3, 1967. Multiple companies from the 173rd started sweeping through the dense jungle around Dak To. Right from the start, things felt wrong. The jungle was too quiet. Any experienced soldier will tell you that when the jungle goes silent, something bad is about to happen. The normal sounds of birds and insects had disappeared. The NVA was close. Companies moved slowly through the undergrowth. Visibility was almost zero. You couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The canopy above was so thick that sunlight barely made it through. Everything was shadows and shapes. The heat was unbearable. Soldiers were carrying over 60 pounds of gear through terrain that seemed designed to break men. Steep hills, thick vines, mud that sucked at your boots with every step.
On November 6th, Charlie Company made contact with the enemy. But this wasn't the usual hit-and-run tactics the NVA normally used. They stood and fought hard. The Americans called in artillery and air support. The jungle erupted in explosions. Trees were shredded. The ground shook. But when the smoke cleared, the NVA was still there, still fighting. That's when commanders realized they weren't dealing with a small enemy force. This was something much bigger. More companies pushed into the area. Alpha Company, Bravo Company, Delta Company. Each one ran into heavy resistance. The NVA had prepared defensive positions that were almost invisible until you were right on top of them. Bunkers built from logs and packed earth that could withstand direct hits from artillery. Spider holes where single soldiers could pop up, fire, and disappear. The Americans were walking into a meat grinder, and they knew it. But the worst was yet to come. On November 19th, orders came down for the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry to take Hill 875. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong again. The hill was a fortress. The NVA had turned it into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire war.
and they had over 1,000 soldiers dug in and waiting.
The assault on Hill 875 began in the early morning darkness. Companies A, C, and D started moving up the steep slopes. The jungle was so thick they had to hack their way through with machetes. Every step was a struggle. The hill rose up at a brutal angle. Men slipped on loose soil and roots. The heat was already building, even though the sun had barely risen. Around midday, they hit the first defensive line. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions. Americans dove for cover, returned fire, called for support. But the NVA positions were so well hidden and so well built that small arms fire did almost nothing. Soldiers tried to advance, got cut down. Tried again, got cut down again. The hillside started filling up with wounded and dead.
Charlie Company pushed forward on the left flank. They managed to get within yards of the NVA bunkers. Then all hell broke loose. The North Vietnamese had planned for this. They let the Americans get close. Then they opened up with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, rocket-propelled grenades. It was a trap, and the Americans had walked right into it. What happened next turned into the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire Vietnam War. The jungle was too thick for either side to see clearly. Soldiers were fighting at distances of just a few feet, sometimes less. Paratroopers charged bunkers with grenades and rifles. NVA soldiers came out to meet them. They fought hand-to-hand, bayonets, rifle butts, knives. Men wrestling in the mud, killing each other with their bare hands.
Private First Class Carlos Lozada was manning an M60 machine gun when his position got overrun. He could have retreated, should have retreated. Instead, he stayed behind to cover his squad's withdrawal. He fired his machine gun until the barrel was glowing red hot, until the NVA were climbing over dead bodies to get to him. He killed dozens of enemy soldiers before they finally took him down. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously. Specialist 4 John Barnes saw his squad leader get hit, went to pull him back, got shot himself, kept going anyway, dragged the wounded man to cover while bullets tore through the foliage around them, then went back for another wounded soldier, and another. He made 4 trips into the killing zone before he finally collapsed from blood loss, lived somehow, got the Distinguished Service Cross.
The fighting went on for hours. Neither side gave an inch. The Americans couldn't retreat down the hill. The NVA wouldn't abandon their positions, so they just kept killing each other at point-blank range. The jungle floor was covered in shell casings and blood. Wounded men screamed for medics who couldn't reach them. Dead bodies piled up. The smell of cordite and death filled the air. Then things got even worse. American commanders called in close air support. F-100 jets came screaming in low over the jungle canopy, dropped bombs and napalm on the enemy positions. But the jungle canopy was so thick and the combat so close that it was almost impossible to tell where the American lines ended and the NVA lines began. At 1600 hours, one of the bombs fell short. It landed right in the middle of the American positions.
The explosion was catastrophic. 42 American soldiers were killed instantly. Another 45 were wounded. In a single moment, the battalion lost a quarter of its strength. Men were thrown through the air by the blast, buried under dirt and debris. The survivors were stunned, deafened. But the NVA didn't give them time to recover. They immediately launched a counterattack. Wave after wave of North Vietnamese soldiers came charging out of their bunkers. They were screaming, firing from the hip, throwing grenades. The Americans had just survived a bombing by their own side, and now they had to fight off a human wave attack. But they held. Somehow they held. Every man who could still hold a rifle formed a defensive line. They fired until their barrels were too hot to touch, until they ran out of ammunition. Then they picked up weapons from the dead and kept fighting.
Night fell, and the battle didn't stop. It just got darker and more confused. Muzzle flashes lit up the jungle. Tracers streaked through the darkness. Men fired at sounds and shadows. You couldn't tell friend from enemy. Americans and NVA soldiers stumbled into each other in the pitch black, fought and killed each other without ever seeing their opponent's face. Resupply choppers tried to come in, but the NVA anti-aircraft fire was too heavy. Several helicopters got shot down trying to reach the trapped paratroopers. The men on Hill 875 were cut off, low on ammunition, low on water, surrounded by enemy forces, and they had over 100 wounded who needed immediate medical evacuation. The situation was desperate.
Captain Harold Kaufman, the Charlie Company commander, was moving between positions trying to organize the defense when he got hit. Shrapnel tore through his legs and chest. He refused evacuation, stayed in command, kept directing his men even as he bled out. He died on that hillside, still giving orders, still fighting. The night dragged on forever. Men dug shallow fighting positions with their helmets and bare hands, shared ammunition, shared water, held each other when the fear got too bad. Some prayed, some cried, some just stared into the darkness and waited for dawn or death, whichever came first.
November 20th brought no relief. The NVA launched another attack at first light. The Americans were exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and pure stubbornness. But they fought back with everything they had left. Artillery fire rained down on the NVA positions all day long. The hillside was getting torn apart. Trees were just splintered stumps. The ground was cratered and scarred. But the NVA held on. It took until November 23rd for reinforcements to finally fight their way through. When they reached the survivors on Hill 875, they found men who looked like walking dead. Hollow eyes, faces black with powder burns and dirt, uniforms torn and soaked with blood. Some didn't even react when help arrived. They just sat there, staring at nothing.
The Battle of Dak To lasted 22 days. When it was over, the 173rd Airborne had suffered 376 killed and over 1,500 wounded. Almost half the brigade became casualties. The NVA lost an estimated 1,500 killed, but numbers don't tell the real story. They never do. What happened to Dak To changed everyone who survived it. These were professional soldiers who had seen combat before, but nothing like this. The fighting had been so close and so brutal that men had nightmares about it for the rest of their lives. Some never talked about it at all. Couldn't. The memories were too painful.
The battle proved several things that military commanders didn't want to admit. It proved that the North Vietnamese were willing to stand and fight even when facing overwhelming firepower. It proved they could match American soldiers in straight combat. It proved that all the technology and air support in the world didn't matter much when you were fighting hand-to-hand in thick jungle. It also proved what individual soldiers were capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. Men who should have broken didn't. Men who should have run stayed and fought. They did things that seemed impossible, not because they were heroes or because they loved war, but because the guy next to them needed them to, because their brothers were fighting and dying and they couldn't abandon them.
The battle had another effect too. When news of Dak To reached the American public, support for the war took another hit. Americans watched footage of wounded paratroopers being carried off helicopters, read casualty lists in newspapers, started asking harder questions about what the hell their sons and brothers were dying for in those distant jungles. The battle didn't end the war, but it was another crack in the foundation of public support. For the survivors, life went on, but it was never the same. Some stayed in the military, some got out as soon as their time was up, but all of them carried Dak To with them for the rest of their lives. In reunions years later, grown men would break down talking about that hill, about the friends they lost, about the things they saw and did, about surviving something that by all rights should have killed them.
Il-875 itself went back to being just another anonymous piece of jungle. The Americans didn't even try to hold it. They took it at terrible cost and left. Because that's how Vietnam worked. Hills and villages changed hands and nothing really changed at all. The war just ground on. More battles, more casualties, more young men sent to fight and die in a war that nobody could figure out how to win. Today, the hill is overgrown again. The bunkers have collapsed, the craters have filled in. Nature reclaimed what man tried to destroy. But if you go there, if you dig in the soil, you still find evidence of what happened. Bullet casings, pieces of shrapnel, sometimes even bones. The jungle remembers, even if the world has forgotten.
The Battle of Dak To stands as one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the entire Vietnam War. It showed both the courage and the futility of that conflict. Men fought with incredible bravery for a piece of ground that ultimately meant nothing in the larger scope of the war. They killed and died and suffered in ways most people can't imagine. And then the war just moved on to the next battle, the next hill, the next generation of young men who would learn the same brutal lessons their predecessors had learned.